paper. It's called Outsourcing and a Mistaken Theory of Value. And it came about, I've had an interesting relationship with Paul Craig Roberts. He actually influenced me a lot in legal, right about here, okay, influenced me a lot in legal thinking. Unfortunately, the guy who helped give us supply-side economics is now giving us what I think is a really crank theory on outsourcing. But unfortunately, again, often crank theories start getting legs, especially during a recession. During a recession, let's just face it, that the last thing people want to know is the truth. They're not particularly interested in the Austrian business cycle theory, because the Austrian business cycle theory says, by the way, we're going to have a recession and it's going to be nasty, and on the other side of it we can have a recovery, because we have people like, of course, Paul Krugman, who believe that you can just perpetuate the boom conditions forever by printing money. By the way, I would like to make a plug. I do have a blog called Krugman in Wonderland. And it's got dashes between Krugman and in Wonderland, and it's one of the Blogspot ones. So I would urge you to go to that site sometime and make me feel good about myself. All right. So I've called it Outsourcing and a Mistaken Theory of Value. So let's see how well my very first PowerPoint goes. Okay. Outsourcing, according to Paul Craig Roberts, now he used to be Assistant Secretary of the Treasury in the Reagan administration, is a greater threat than terrorism. In other words, that see, that's nothing. That's just a building going down. We're talking about outsourcing here, much worse. Okay. So, a serious accusation. This is what he writes. Free traders are resurrecting class war, not because they are Marxists, but because they confuse free trade with global labor arbitrage. Free traders turn cold shoulders to U.S. job losses from offshore outsourcing because they mistake the losses for the beneficial workings of comparative advantage. Committed to a 200-year-old theory that they no longer understand, free traders are cheering on the destruction of middle-class jobs and the dismantling of the ladders of upward mobility that make large income disparities politically acceptable. That's a mouthful. And they probably, I suspect those free traders also beat puppies and stick pins in dolls and things. But nonetheless, this is the claim. All right. Now, according to Roberts, we have the theory of, everybody knows the theory of comparative advantage. I don't think, and so what he writes though is it holds only when capital cannot cross international borders. In other words, that now labor can cross borders kind of, but what Roberts is saying is that when in 1815, when Ricardo wrote his principles of political economy and taxation, that factors of production were relatively fixed in each country, and so you could therefore get a real clear advantage, a real clear picture of what comparative advantage would look like. So he says, Ricardo imposed the condition of relative capital immobility internationally in order that specialization according to comparative advantage could occur. Otherwise, country's capital would flow to absolute advantage abroad. When U.S. firms substitute foreign labor for domestic labor in their production for domestic markets, capital is flowing to absolute advantage. Now, I have no idea what he's saying. I'll get into that in a minute, but that's where Roberts is coming from. And so it's that, okay, once capital flows, then all bets are off, we're back to absolute advantage again. Okay, I will deal with that specifically, but, alright, so we have the following scenario. U.S. firms, these are the greedy capitalists, unilaterally decide to outsource because they can make more profits, especially they outsource the high wage, what he calls the high wage, high value added jobs, okay? The loss of that value added, okay, is a net loss to the U.S. economy. All right, this is important to keep in mind as well. Furthermore, workers are unemployed and future workers become discouraged as they know their jobs will be outsourced. Even if capitalists make net profits, they gain at the expense of workers, and the income disparities weaken the economy. So this is his whole point about income disparities. Okay, now this is very interesting. These net losses have a dual effect. Number one, we're no longer manufacturing these high value added, we no longer have the high wage, high value added jobs. All right, and so now these people are making goods abroad with the idea of importing them back to the into the U.S. economy. However, that because we're producing less, now they can't import back what they were making abroad to import here in the first place. Thus, according to Roberts, the economy becomes a third world economy because firm owners decide to engage in outsourcing abroad. So this will be our future. And kind of cute, really, but they need to recycle those bottles, all right? And if they can just maybe what they need are green jobs, and then everything will be fine. But all right, I want to read a couple more Roberts quotes. What is happening is that foreign labor is substituted for U.S. labor in the production of the goods and services that Americans consume. Americans lose the income and employment associated with the production of the goods that they consume. This is really starting to sound a little bit like Marx and alienation, but I'm not going to call him a Marxist. The loss of these jobs is, quote, fool's gold for companies. Corporate America's short-term mentality stemming from bonuses tied to quarterly results is causing U.S. companies to lose not only their best employees, their human capital, but also the consumers who buy their products. Employees displaced by foreigners and left unemployed or in lower paid work have a reduced presence in the consumer market. They provide fewer retirement savings for new investment. Okay, so you can see how the dynamic is going here. And with Roberts, it all begins with outsourcing. That's ground zero. That outsourcing, that what happened, all of a sudden corporations became greedy, and not only that, but you started having, that these people abroad got rid of communism. It's terrible. I mean, the Chinese, I know that they've got a communist party, but they're just not very good communists anymore. And and all of a sudden you've got an educated workforce that will work for less than what we work for. Okay. As proof, what he does, I've got a quote here, plus an email that he received from somebody. Okay, as I write about the economic hardships created for Americans by Wall Street and corporate greed, and by indifferent and bribed political representatives, I get many letters from former middle-class families who are being driven into penury. Penury or whatever. Here is one recently arrived, and it goes on. How much time do I have? Oh yeah. It'll take me at least 15 minutes to read that. But thank you for your continued truthful commentary on the new economy. My husband and I it's poster children. 9 years ago when we were married, we were both working good-paying, secure jobs in the semiconductor manufacturing industry. Our combined income topped $100,000 a year. We were living the dream. Then the nightmare began. I lost my job in the great tech bubble of 2003. I thought that happened a little bit earlier, but nonetheless. And decided to leave the labor force to care for our infant son. Fine. We tightened the belt, and we started getting squeezed. Expenses rose. We downsized, yet my husband's job stagnated. After several years of no pay raises, he finally lost his job a year and a half ago. But he didn't just lose a job, he lost a career. The semiconductor industry is virtually gone here in Arizona. 3 months later, my husband, with a technical degree and 20 plus years of solid work experience, received one job offer for an entry-level corrections officer. We had to take it at almost a 40% reduction in pay. Bankruptcy followed when our savings were depleted. We lost our house, a car, and any assets we had left. His salary last year, less than $40,000 to support a family of 4. A year and a half later, we were still struggling to get by. I can't find a job that would cover the cost of daycare. We are stuck. Every jump in gas and food prices hit us hard. Without help from my family, we couldn't have made it. So I could tell you just how that new economy has worked for us, but I'd rather not use that kind of language. And what Roberts does, he said, this is going to be the scenario for all of us. So get ready to climb into that barrel and look for those empty bottles. Okay. All right. Well, that's just true. Okay. Does the dynamic that he gives us actually destroy the U.S. economy from within? All right. Well, obviously, if I'm calling my title a mistaken theory of value and other things, well, then I'm going to say no. All right. I start with Bob Murphy, the same Bob Murphy who spoke this morning. The case for free trade really isn't about jobs at all, but rather living standards. In a free labor market, wages and salaries would adjust until all who wanted to work at the prevailing market rates could do so. In such a scenario, dropping tariffs wouldn't create jobs. It would merely shift workers from less to more productive lines. Okay. Now, Roberts points, he says, look, we're not even talking about trade. We're talking about factor mobility. This has nothing to do with actual trade. Because with Roberts, trade is only in finished goods. Okay, finished goods. That's trade. Nothing else is trade. I don't know. It's kind of like he shifts the goalposts a lot, but in his arguments. But nonetheless, the issue, I think that one of the things we're talking about is not jobs. Okay, it actually is living standards. Do we have higher living standards now than we had, say, 30, 40 years ago, or whatever? Yes, we do. I mean, I know Paul Krugman says we're poorer now than we were in the past, as one who moved to Chattanooga in 1964, and one of the places I hated to come to was the state of Alabama because I had never seen so many shacks in my life. I don't see those shacks now. And, the living standards have risen. Okay. Rothbard. Okay, now at the time, if Murray were alive, I'm sure he'd have plenty to say to Craig. But, and by the way, I will also point out, I get a lot of emails from him, about 10 a day. Most of them deleted. Most of them say things like, I won't use the language that he uses, but Americans are all stupid. Economists have their head in the sand. You libertarians have your head in the sand. You don't see what's happening. And I sent him a letter one time, tried to engage him a little bit, and he writes back, says, you sound like what you're saying is you want the entire economy to be outsourced. It's okay. Every once in a while, Lou sends him an email. I just gave up on it. On some areas, like on law, he's actually, he's still pretty good. And on things like war and all that, pretty good. But, unfortunately here, well, he's not pretty good. All right. Now, Rothbard does say something interesting, I think very important about trade. The best way to look at tariffs or import quotas or other protectionist restraints, and by the way, because ultimately what Roberts recommends are tariffs and quotas. Okay, he actually, I remember seeing an email. I asked him and he said that we need to have quotas and all that. Okay, or other protectionist restraints is to forget about political boundaries. Political boundaries of nations may be important for other reasons, but they have no economic meaning whatsoever. Now, this is important because Rothbard is saying we are talking about exchange. There isn't anything that's going to allow America to become wealthier by making it more difficult to engage in exchange abroad. Now that, is pretty much standard free trade policy. Okay, now he talks about what happened when we did have, quote, outsourcing. The very thing Roberts is complaining about, if you remember back in the 30s and really on to about the 1960s, that you had textile factories closing in the north, and other kinds of factories as well, closing in the north, and then moving to the South, places like North Carolina and South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama. So it says, during the 1966 congressional battle over higher federal minimum wage, for example, the late Senator Jacob Javits freely admitted that one of his main reasons for supporting the bill was to cripple the southern competitors of New York textile firms. Since southern wages are generally lower than in the North, business firms hit hardest by an increased minimum wage, and the workers struck by unemployment will be located in the South. All right, and so and again, Roberts would argue, by the way, it's those high wages in the North. If you locate to the South, then we'll all be poor. All right, now I'm going to come at Roberts from two different points. First, his value theory, speaking specifically of value added, which I have at the bottom. It's an accounting concept. It's not an economic concept. That we begin with, as Austrians, begin with the final product. For that matter, you've got Marshall and derived demand. You begin with the final product. You impute backwards. All right, that even though produced good, yes, at different stages, it adds on and adds on. I can assure you, folks, you don't want to buy a Ferrari without an engine. That it's not like, okay, now it's worth, $90,000. We'll put this $10,000 engine in. I know it's a lot more than that, but just bear with. Put the $10,000, and now instead of being worth $90,000, now it's $100,000. No, Ferrari without an engine, it's not going to be worth $90,000. All right. His value theory really is a little more than a restatement of the cost of production theory of value. This is what it is. What is he saying? He's saying that the production itself and the wages paid and all that is what creates value here. All right? And it obviously conflicts with the Austrian theory. All right, on comparative advantage is not really a theory. It's not speculation. It's a restatement of opportunity cost. Okay, let's change the wording. Put another way, Roberts is saying that if capital is mobile across international borders, opportunity cost no longer matters. Now, this is interesting. I mean, this is rewriting the fundamental laws of economics. What he's saying is that if capital goes cross borders, then boom, everything changes. There is no more opportunity cost. I go, that's interesting. That nobody makes decisions based on opportunity costs anymore. Very strange. All right. Okay, question is, why do firms outsource? Well, one is the productivity issue, where, and I give in the paper, which I haven't finished sourcing, and the paper is way too long and it sucks. And I would not recommend reading it right now. It is finished. It's just, I've got to do some stuff to it. But you have a situation where, for example, the Kia plant moving in. All right, that's going to put upward pressure on wages elsewhere in the area. There's a productivity issue there. Okay, and so as what was happening in New York was that there were other kinds of businesses that were having higher wages, that in fact forcing up wages, that would make it so the owners of capital in certain, of certain kinds of goods are going to have to go where the public is going to be willing to buy the final product that doesn't have a higher price because, well, I got to pay my higher wages. It's like GM. And so, but the second one I think is much more important. Governments force up the opportunity cost of labor. But they don't add anything to it. There's no productivity. They just make it harder and more expensive to do business, but you don't get anything for it. They just raise your costs. They raise business costs. And in fact, Roberts is arguing for laws and regulations and the like that will force up business costs with the idea somehow this will make us wealthier. And so I think that, in fact, here's my concluding paragraph. If we've learned anything, watching the disasters, you can't create prosperity by fiat. Okay, Furthermore, Roberts wants us to believe that the bloated wage contracts at places like General Motors and Chrysler somehow are responsible for creating wealth instead of actually destroying it. It's like, Henry Ford doubled his labor costs, or doubled the wages that he paid the workers, and that's what created the middle class. Yeah, a little factory in Dearborn creates the middle class, and without people realizing the opportunity cost reasons why Ford made that particular move. And so, here's the thing. In the end, it really sounds good. He had an op-ed in the New York Times with Senator Charles Schumer. And, we understand that's all the rules are different now. We have mobile capital, so therefore comparative advantage no longer operates. So what he's really saying is opportunity cost no longer exists. And, the rest of us are sitting back and saying, that doesn't make much sense. Thank you.